It is not that this goodness of doing something for society is not coming at any high personal cost.
This field combines physics, chemistry, engineering, math, data, math in the form of data analysis, computational techniques. So we're talking about a very technical field. And so you're talking about jobs that are going to be reasonably well paid.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Professor Mahesh Podcast. This podcast is brought to you by IITM Global, an initiative of IIT Madras to take everything IIT Madras and everything India to the world stage. Our teaching, our resources, our research, our startups, our thinking broadly. This podcast is your resource to help you make informed career decisions, future simplified, as we call. My guest today is a fascinating person. He's devoted practically his entire professional life to one single problem. And in this day and age, I think that in itself is a rare quality. We tend to jump around professions a lot. So that's one quality I right away see in him that I admire. And we're going to talk more about that as we go along. Professor Suresh Dhaniyala from Clarkson University. Welcome, Suresh. Suresh has spent his entire professional life thinking about air quality, aerosols, and what makes the air we breathe, what it is, and how can we keep it clean for the next generation of young men and women that are to come. So let's start the conversation to understand what are some new and emerging career directions that one could choose to invest their life in, so we leave a better planet for the next generation. Suresh, let's start off with your own academic evolution and journey. You and I were classmates here at IIT Madras. You studied naval architecture, and I'm sure that laid a strong foundation for your later career. Let's talk about your IIT Madras days.
Mahesh, thank you for having me on the podcast, firstly. Obviously, we started our IIT Madras story in 1988. And in those days, your IIT JEE rank decided where you would go. And so we didn't necessarily know what we were getting into the field. So you could say to some extent we weren't necessarily selecting to do or entirely responsible for our selection of our academic initial degree. But I would say that I think what we have realized in going into the IIT program is that what it builds is a strong foundation that really sets you up to do pretty much anything in the engineering side of things, independent of what your degree label is. And to some extent, some of my evolution, I would say, is built on the fact that we were given this very, very, very strong foundation over which we could, build other structures, as I might call your subsequent progression.
I think that in itself is a very, very good, very first early takeaway for our audience, in the sense you may be in a particular discipline, but focus on being good at that discipline, and you can pick up the general engineering skills that you can use to transform yourself as professionally as you go forward in your own lives. You've done that, and from IIT Madras, you went off to Delaware.
That's correct. The University of Delaware for a master's in mechanical engineering there.
Yeah, and then you that's your grounding in air quality in some sense. That's where you got started.
Yeah, that's right. So again, the IIT Madras program allowed me to build these very strong fundamentals, including in fluid mechanics. One of the fields that has subsequently been where I've gone deeper in, and I recognized in going to grad school that fluid mechanics was an area of interest for me, but also an area of interest, or an area that was addressed in great detail in the mechanical engineering program. But in the University of Delaware, where I got in with a teaching assistantship, which meant I was not committed to a particular faculty member for a research advisement, allowed me to go and talk to the faculty there about their research interests, their projects that were currently in motion, um, and give me maybe my first, I would say, a first understanding of the breadth of research that happens in graduate school in a single department. There's everything from biology to space, all happening under the mechanical engineering department, and that's where I understood. In talking to one of the faculty members there, Tony Wexler, who's still a mentor to me, that this the air quality problem has a dimension in engineering that required the integration of fluid mechanics, numerical methods, and chemistry, and all of that to solve it. And so that was my first introduction to the fact that something like air quality and air pollution could be a mechanical engineering problem.
Wow. Then from Delaware, you went off to Minnesota to do a PhD, and then I think joined Tony Wexler back again at Caltech.
So Tony Wexler was from Caltech, and is so I sort of went. I sort of connected back to his institution, alma mater. But so with Tony Wexler, what I did there was numerical methods. We did numerical modeling. That really was an extension of some of the computational fluid dynamics work that I did for my undergraduate thesis right here in IIT Madras, where I took a computational fluid dynamics course right next door in the Aerospace department. That gave me a flavor of how numerical methods can be really powerful in sort of reproducing the physics of flow over very complex objects, and so you can see that there are these strings that connect every stage of my academic career. So the foundations, including in computational fluids, led me to the master's work in Delaware. And for the next work in Minnesota, my introduction to air quality there in Delaware was what I wanted to build upon in Minnesota. Why Minnesota? It's because in Delaware, my project was numerical and computational. And as I was doing that, I realized that what I was lacking was an experimental knowledge, an experimental. I had no experience in this problem of air pollution from an experimentalist perspective. I didn't know how to measure these particles I was modeling. I had never seen stuff that I was modeling, and it was important to me that I get into experimental work. So the particle technology lab at the University of Minnesota has had, when I joined, over 50 years of history with experimental aerosol work, and so it drew me into going there because I figured that I wanted to put myself in a bit of an uncomfortable situation when I was still a student, because I had no experimental background, and so me going in there meant I was going in pretty raw, but I felt like that was my time to go and learn and pick up that expertise. And I was lucky to get that opportunity to join that lab, and so I jumped on it. And then subsequently, I actually got a faculty offer right out of PhD, but I still felt like my training was incomplete, because in Minnesota I was working on filtration, one aspect of aerosol science, which is how do we take these particles out of the air, what are the mechanics of these particles, as they travel through these filters. As you might imagine, you might think that the particles are sieved out of the air, but they're actually removed because of fluid mechanics. As they pass around the fibers in the filter, they can get collected through diffusion and deposition and mechanisms that, for me then, was not what I'd initially imagined how filters work. So I began to realize that there's more to studying before I can jump into a career whether it's academic or otherwise, where I wouldn't say that the education stops, but the onus shifts to being a leader at some point. But for me, I felt like I needed more training to get there. And so that's where I opted to go for a postdoctoral work. And I had a couple of opportunities, and the one in Caltech appealed to me because, again, and this might be a bit of a recurring trend in sort of what I've been doing is I've been trying to put myself in a bit of an uncomfortable new position, whether it meant transitioning from naval architecture, where we were looking at flow around big objects floating in water, to small specks in air with air pollution and aerosol particles in Delaware, and from numerical work to experimental work in Minnesota, to going from slow speed flow, Stokes flow, as it might be technically referred to high speed, compressible, turbulent flow that is relevant to transonic flows. In Caltech, to me, appealed. It's a very, very different aspect that I wanted to learn. And so there, the project there was in many ways diametrically opposite to what I was doing in Minnesota. So we're looking at putting instruments on an aircraft that goes at 0.7 Mach, which is about 220 meters per second. At the fastest, when we are driving here, we're going at 10, 20 meters per second. So you can think of this as being 10 times faster or more. And we were studying particles in the stratosphere, 20 kilometers above, which meant complete automation of instruments and a very different analysis of the kind of data that we'll get from it. And we were looking at ozone loss. So it's an atmospheric chemistry problem, one that I was not exposed to before. So all of that was both frightening and appealing, because again, I felt like universities are a time to put yourself in an uncomfortable situation, because nowhere else will your time there afford you to learn at a leisurely rate, without somebody waiting at the other end saying, "Come on, let's move." Right? So that the opportunity to learn, the opportunity to build these skills, was what sort of drove me all the way out to the postdoctoral work.
Wonderful. So from computational fluid dynamics at Delaware to lab experiments in Minnesota to field experiments at Caltech in completely different domains. I think, as you just said, putting yourself in these increasingly uncomfortable positions, I think is a very important aspect of how we grow as professional individuals. And while we are rewarded for the deep expertise we may have in one niche area, we really grow to become a deep expert by putting ourselves in these sort of disparate disciplines. This is wonderful. Let's switch gears and talk about air quality itself. It doesn't need an introduction to the Indian audience. Our cities are growing so fast and so organically. Just people moving from their own self-interest. Opportunities bring them. Even rural areas are now experiencing changes in their air quality. So let's first understand what we mean by air quality. Sometimes even on all our TV channels now we see an AQI flashed. Occasionally you'll see a PM 2.5 or a PM 10. Help us understand these terms first. what is PM 2.5, what is PM 10, and what is AQI?
Yeah, maybe we'll start with some background for AQI. Um, so the so there are 6 criteria pollutants. So what we mean by that are these pollutants that we would be concerned about and want to monitor and control nationwide. So those 6 criteria pollutants, and there's carbon monoxide, ozone, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, PM, particulate matter, and we'll get to that in a second, PM 2.5, PM 10, and in the US there is lead in PM 10. So you won't know how much lead there is in particles because of its neurological implications. So these criteria pollutants are known to have health effects. They are ubiquitous. So everywhere you go, you're going to see these pollutants at different levels. And while you could argue that there is no safe level, most studies show that you reach a threshold, and which is where you start seeing observable health effects. So that's what these criteria pollutants are. But these are 6 pollutants, and their threshold levels are different. And even for practitioners in the field, it's difficult to keep up with where the thresholds are. So to keep things relatively, I would say, accessible to the general audience, policymakers have come up with AQI, an air quality index that integrates these six pollutants, and there's a threshold value for AQI that we can relate to 100. If it's below that, it means that none of the pollutants are above threshold. So even if one pollutant goes above threshold value, this AQI value will go up. So we calculate this index. We set 100 as the threshold value that the government has for a safe value. And so we say that if it's at that value or at 100, you're below that proportionally, you are safer, and above that, you're getting proportionally higher. And for each of the parameters, you can calculate and set 100 as this number that's equivalent to the threshold value for, let's say, carbon monoxide. And then you take the maximum of those 6 values and report it as a single AQI. So if carbon monoxide is high, or ozone is high, or PM 2.5 is high, it doesn't matter, then the AQI is going to be high. And so when you see an AQI value, and if it's below 100, that means all of the pollutants are below threshold values. If it's above 100, at least one of the values has gone above threshold. Of these, while all of these pollutants have health effects, the one that I might argue and is generally recognized as having probably the greatest health effect would be the particulate matter matrix, whether it's PM 2.5 or PM 10. And I'll argue in a few minutes that PM 2.5 being the more important of the two. But particulate matter, as we are sitting in this room, we can't, the air looks very clean in the sense that, there isn't a haze between you and me. I don't feel anything, we don't smell anything, but there's a lot of particles in the air floating here. And so if you weigh, and these are particles of different sizes. And if we could size these particles right now, you would find that they exist in all sorts of sizes, from a few nanometers all the way to maybe 10, 20 microns, maybe 20, 30 microns, right? And just for the audience sake, the width of your hair.
Almost a factor of 100 to 1,000 more. I mean,
yeah, exactly. I'm saying a few nanometers to, so let's say 2 nanometers to 20, that's 5 orders of magnitude right there, right? 4 orders of magnitude. So that's...
And in comparison, a human hair is?
It's about 70 micron, right? So these are the biggest particles, or maybe let's say about, just for keeping in the order of magnitude, about 1/10 of that, let's say 7 micron. But there are bigger particles than that in the air right here. So everything here is about 10 times smaller than the hair or much smaller, right? That's why they're largely invisible. Um, and if we weighed all these particles, found out what the weight of these particles are, smaller than 2.5 micron in a meter cubed, let's say, or a centimeter cubed, different units. So in that meter cubed, if we found out what the weight of these particles are, of particles smaller than 2.5 micron, that would be PM 2.5. Anything, if you weighed all the particles smaller than 10 micron, that would be PM 10.
So PM10 will always be a bigger number than PM2.5.
Exactly.
It should
so
be
the
much.
PM10 includes PM 2.5 and the mass of particles between 2.5 to 10.
Right. And because mass goes as diameter cube, PM10 would be much bigger than PM2.5?
Maybe. It depends on how many particles there are. You're right. If there's a substantial number of particles in the 2.5 to 10 micron, you should see the PM10 could be much larger than 2.5, even with few particles in there. Oftentimes, indoor, there may not be a lot of those particles, so they could be similar. Yeah.
So, if I'm on a hazy day outside, what we see is mostly PM10 and larger, or is a haze also possible due to very, very small particles?
That's a great question. So when we step out, and maybe the most visual of the air quality problems is haze. So the haze comes about because particles, when they interact with light, they're just going to scatter light. And so instead of, if we are, if there's a building out there, light would reflect off of the buildings and come to our eyes. But with particles in between, that light is scattered out and the whole thing is hazy. And particles will scatter light all the way down to the wavelength of light, and maybe about half the wavelength of light. And wavelength of light, when you get to the blue wavelengths, about 400 nanometers-ish. So particles down to about 200 nanometers and above will be scattering light, will be creating haze. So it's not just the particles that contribute to PM10, but also the particles that contribute to PM2.5 that's going to scatter light. And clearly, the bigger particles will scatter more light. And there's an approximate relationship of diameter squared. So bigger particles will scatter a lot more light, but there's a lot of small particles. So, there's contributions across the spectrum.
Why these two numbers, 2.5 and 10? I mean, what is the scientific basis for those two numbers?
No, it's that's again an interesting question there, right? And it's partly chemistry, partly biology. So particles of all sorts of sizes exist, and it turns out that we've got some really good inbuilt mechanism to remove many of these particles. And to start with, the structure of our nose facing down allows us to eliminate any big particles from coming in. And when these particles do come in, we've got the biology of our nose with our hair in there and so on that acts to filter these particles. So we can filter out a lot of particles through the nose and maybe the upper part of our respiratory system down to out here, the entrance of our the main respiratory system. We can filter out most particles greater than 10 micron. So anything greater than 10 micron, we are capturing out here, and we can dispose it off through a variety of mechanisms straight out of our body, right? Whether you cough it out or sneeze it out and so on. It is smaller than 10 micron particles that can make it to your lungs. And the 10 to 2.5 micron particles, and the smaller the particles, let's put it this way, the smaller the particles, deeper it goes into your lungs. And while we inhale, when we exhale out, some of these particles do come out. But smaller the particles, they go deeper in and they get trapped in there and they aren't coming out. And so in general, smaller particles go deeper, can get collected deeper in the lungs, and then the only mechanism to remove it is through your, the bloodstream and so on. And they could eventually come out. But you're exposing your entire body to what you're breathing. And then you're impacting your lungs all the way down into your alveolar region, which is where a lot of our exchange of oxygen, gas exchange takes place, right? And the question is, so that explains why PM10, because we've got this filtering mechanism. 10 micron and below is what gets into the deeper respiratory system, long-term health effects. Why 2.5? So there have been a number of field studies done in early, maybe between 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s that have shown that in general, if you were to go make measurements out in typical urban environments, what you will find are multiple modes in the size distribution. Which means the number of particles in different sizes will vary, obviously, and they vary such that you get a lot of particles in certain small sizes, and then in the intermediate sizes you get a lot of particles, and then you get a different mode of particles in the bigger sizes. And one of the valleys is around 2.5 micron. And what distinguishes particles smaller than 2.5 micron with the ones that are bigger is that many of the particles generated from 2.5 micron are chemically generated, meaning mostly by combustion.
The particles below 2.
Below 2.5, smaller particles are generated by combustion, and the bigger ones typically mechanically. Could be, by cars grinding up dust and so on. And so the compositions tend to be different. So in general, PM 2.5 coming from combustion activities, whether it's industries or from your tailpipe emissions, can tend to have a different composition than the mechanically generated, more dust-like particles that will be above 2.5. Different compositions mean different health effects. And the smaller sub 2.5 micron particles chemically generated could be more carcinogenic, for example, some of them. And so the health impacts are very different. So we are trying to track both of them. They both have health effects, different health impacts, different sources, and so we'd want to keep track of them.
Very nice, very interesting. That brings us to the next question, very organically in some sense. Where do these particles come from, and how do they get into the air? You talked of combustion, you talked of mechanical grinding. How long has this been a problem? Given that most of what you're describing is man-made activities, is anthropogenic activity.
Yeah. Well, there's natural particles.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. Good.
When an ocean wave creation happens, it gives out small drops. Water evaporates, and you end up with sodium chloride particles. So if you are by the beach, right, and then you're sweating. In Chennai, you're sweating. You got salt on your face. But by the beach, you can people will tell you can taste the salt in the air. It is actually true that there's salt particles generated there. Trees give out volatile organic compounds that can then form particles. So actually, you could go to a very pristine forest and you'll see some haze in there, because there's gases coming out from trees that then they're somewhat low vapor pressure, so they can then form particles, and then they can create a bit of a haze because particles create haze. So there's natural particles there that we are not responsible for. And then there's anthropogenic stuff, which is human-made. When did we first start that? Right when we first discovered fire, right? So thousands of years back, when we figured out how to create fire, we started putting out anthropogenic particles. And so right now, you can go to different areas of India, and you'd have different sources that are predominant. In urban areas, southern cities, I think in Bangalore, for example, and probably Chennai, the top sources will be transportation and industrial. If you go just, maybe past Tiruvallur into the more rural area, you get to domestic fuels being a major source of pollution, because people are burning firewood, or there is, cow dung is a major source of fuel for cooking, and they create. There's a lot of pollution from that. That is obviously a major source of pollution for people indoors, because you're cooking in tight kitchens with poor ventilation with that stuff. But some of those particles remain, depending upon what the meteorology is. They can also be a major local pollution for that village.
That explains the government's push to go LPG in a big way across rural India and across, it saves lives, clearly.
That's correct. There are studies that show that, to some extent, this push towards LPG could be maybe the biggest bang for buck with respect to air quality, because it's not just. So one is, what is the air quality outdoors? The other is what is the impact of air quality on people, which is both the combination of what you're exposed to outdoors and what you're exposed to indoors. And the domestic fuel burning is a major problem indoors, and of course a problem outdoors. So that combination tackled through LPG is obviously, it can have big impacts. Additionally, there's obviously biomass burning, which is a bigger problem in the north, around Punjab and Haryana. And then there's, natural sources can still be an issue, especially in drier places with Rajasthan. We know dust is a problem there.
So the threshold for each of these, as you said, there's a safe threshold that's been established over time.
Yeah.
With sound science backing that.
Yeah.
But we also see over time the thresholds coming down.
Yeah.
What's the motivation for that? I mean, if something was established as safe 60 years ago,
right,
what's the motivation to decrease it today?
So, there have been some landmark studies in early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, where they established without doubt that there is a correlation to for air quality to mortality.
Okay.
So, they show that if, there's a very famous Harvard 6-city study where they looked at 6 cities with different air pollution and controlled and had about 8,000 people, followed over 15 years, and then controlled for whether they were smoking and other stuff, to then show that there's a direct correlation to ambient air quality, outside air quality, to mortality. So if you were in a more polluted place, as defined by PM 2.5, you had, and this is for particulates, and PM 2.5, there was a recognized increase in mortality. And in those studies, it was shown that you've got to exceed at that time, I forget the exact numbers, about 12 microgram per meter cubed or so for PM 2.5 before you can see these effects for annual average. Now, as we've got newer techniques, as we have expanded the study beyond those 6 cities, and remember, every city has a different profile that contributes, different source profile that contributes to air quality. It is, as you go to different cities with different sources, different industries contributing to local air quality problems, the threshold can be different because they have different compositions. And so in this search for a safe threshold, you try and find, in this diversity of cities, at what values do you not see that mortality effect? So as we expand the number of cities, as we bring better tools to the problem, we are recognizing that there is a measurable impact down to lower values. One other thing I might want to add to it is that our sources are changing themselves. We are putting new sources out there. Just as an example, I'm not saying that this is a PM 2.5 problem. But just as an example, the quality of gasoline has changed over time, right? The nature of engines have changed in cars. Now we are changing the nature of fuel itself, right? We have had CNG fuels, and now we're beginning to put in EVs, and they all create a different impact. And you might think EV is not a polluting element, and we of course understand that the electricity is still a polluting element, right? So that changes the profile. So rather than putting out immediate combustion products from
The tailpipe.
gasoline tailpipe, you might be putting out more from if you opt to provide more electricity from coal. Again, you're probably putting more on coal, and depending on what the emission control technologies are there, you're probably adding more sulfates and depending on what else is in coal, you're adding to it. And even if you don't add coal, you're putting out other stuff, ozone and so on. Lastly, also with EVs, we're beginning to see that there's more brake wear and more tire wear that's coming in the PM 2.5 to PM 10, that range. That's new stuff. Who knows what there aren't any concerns from a health impact, but it is changing what we are breathing a little bit. So we want to keep track of it. So these guidelines will keep getting updated.
Very nice. We will come back to solutions a little later. But really, the one event that defines at least our generation, we'll never forget this, that put air quality in everybody's, all 7 billion people's thoughts, is COVID-19. Tell us a little bit about what we learned during COVID-19 and what did scientists do to help contain as best as they could the transmission of this pandemic during the time. What was your own life like during COVID-19? Let's start with that.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a little bit on the ambient air pollution problem that was, modified by COVID-19, right? Because we didn't go out much and so on. Well, that's an interesting, but maybe the smaller lesson learned. The big one was, so we shut down. We all shut down probably around March, and it was spring break in the U.S. right when this got to a tipping point, so to speak. And I remember when we shut down, we said the university will open up in 2 weeks. Because the idea was, in 2 weeks we'll solve the problem, we'll come back. I mean, there's just so much uncertainty, right? So as an aerosol scientist, I mean, this is the first thing that people were talking about. The big discussion then was 6 foot spacing. If you remember, it's like, you want to be 6 feet away from it.
Social distancing,
right? That was a term that was literally thrown at us. Maintain social distancing. So as aerosol scientists, the first scientists, our entire community recognized that just doesn't make sense. We measure particles.
In fact, that's the first time we saw the word aerosol in rank public discourse.
Correct. As a matter of fact, that's the first time when we said we're working on aerosol science. People, previously, if you said we're working on aerosol science, they would say, "Oh, you guys build those aerosol cans." And so now, they began to understand that we're really dealing with the particles in the air, and so we recognized very quickly, right then and there, that this is a problem that isn't addressed by social distancing. Well, social distancing was important. It was not an end-all of infection prevention. And as a matter of fact, there was nothing magical about 6 feet. 6 feet came about with respect to droplet distance traveled. So, how long will droplets travel and so on. Back of the envelope calculations suggested in 6 feet, they're either going to drop or evaporate and not of concern. And that is that was a concept that was very ingrained and deep in medical science. And it took us, in the aerosol scientists, and we were involved through our aerosol association in trying to sort of re-educate the medical community that needs to be updated. And that, these are The small particles, we know small particles can travel long distances. The first thing we did at the university, and they were very kind about letting us back in before the students came in to just explore, how safe are the classrooms. So we would inject particles and show that they would travel all over the room. There's no safe distance. And so obviously, that became more commonly recognized very quickly. The university shut down. But that's when, at least for me, it was a shift to indoor aerosol measurements and sort of indoor aerosol research. And so number one, we recognize COVID is spread through particles that we are generating as we speak and breathe and, of course, cough and sneeze. But in this case, it's just a lot of these are coming from speaking and breathing. So you wouldn't even know that I am putting out these particles. And so educating the public became a big part of what we were doing. So we had, I gave one of these talks sitting at home. We had given a Zoom call that had about, 150 people from around, a lot of them from the village that we were in, we are in still, Potsdam, but also from around the country. Because, we had a pretty good handle on the particle side of things. And obviously the medical professionals had a pretty good handle on the infection side of things. So it was really important that we combine this information. And I think it was very clear then and there that, again, this and several other problems like these are interdisciplinary in nature. And this is where maybe a little bit of a deep expertise in one field helps you sort of work with researchers in another field who have a deep expertise in that field to combine and solve these problems that really neither of us could individually solve. So our life then was, the research part of our life really picked up. I mean, I got involved in some very interesting projects with a number of agencies that to this day is still ongoing. Yeah.
The mask.
Yeah.
Talk about what the mask actually does.
Yeah. So this, yes, one of the first things that again became common in the general public is that the option of masks was there for us to maybe prevent infection. But so how do masks work? So masks. There's all kinds of masks. So what became popular were cloth masks, easy to make, which we had shown through our experiments and so on, are very ineffective, really. What really works at the high end are the N95 masks, which, if you apply tightly, makes sure that the air is going through these masks. And so the masks have fibers that are very small, in the order of 10 micron or so. And when the particles are going around them, again with fluid mechanics there, these particles can take pathways that are different from airflow because they have inertia, and then they can be collected deep in there. And so they act to capture particles inside them, not on the outside edge, just on the outside layers, but inside them. What's interesting is that some of the but if you've ever worn an N95 mask and you ran up and down the stairs a few times, you would realize that, it really, it reminded you as to how out of shape you were, because you would be you'd be struggling for breath because you are now trying to breathe through that extra pressure drop. So the alternative was to put in a surgical mask. And the surgical masks, much lighter, easier to breathe through, and about 80 to 90% of the same efficiency of the N95 masks, because these have charged fibers in them. So there's an additional electric field that captures these particles. But it also means that if you used it for some time, it became less effective. The charge would dissipate out, and so these couldn't be reused. And so there's a lot of education around, which ones to use, how long can you use, how do you make sure they're airtight, and a lot of that, driven from scientific understanding.
So we are seeing a little bit of an uptick back again in COVID cases over the last 3-4 weeks. I think it's the best advice, the best scientific advice we can give is to use a surgical mask, but change it every so often to keep yourself safe. And the mask does two things. One, it keeps the person safe from the outside infection, and then it also keeps the outside world safe from the aerosols you generate.
Correct. It filters both
You've
ways.
had a chance to study both sides of this, and which one is actually the main purpose of the mask?
So I think the what we have noticed is that if you wore a mask, people around you were about 80% safer than if you were not wearing a mask. But if you were wearing a mask, you were 80 to 90% safer than if you were not wearing a mask. So we were, I remember very early on, we tried to change the story from wear the mask because it's good for others to wear the mask because it's good for you. Because public messaging is so much easier when you say do something that's good for you, and which is it is true. I mean, this is good for you, but I think some of the initial public messaging that do it so that you protect the others was, I think, made it a little less effective in people using it.
While both of them are truths in their own right,
Correct.
the higher truth, so to say, is protect yourself by
100%.
wearing a mask.
And just I want to make one note here. If you're on the streets of Chennai, you'll see a lot of people, especially women wearing a cloth around their nose, and that is actually may not be effective against COVID when you're talking to somebody, but it's a pretty good effective measure against PM 2.5 to 10, the bigger particles in sort of keeping this away from you. Of course, it depends on what kind of cloth and how tight they are and all that. But masking to prevent the health impacts of particles is another good. There's a definite benefit to that.
I think please wear a mask and keep yourself safe, keep the people around you safe. This is the message from the aerosol scientific community. We could do a whole episode on just COVID and the things, the fascinating things we learned about the air around us during that time, but we'll have to move on. Let's now talk about some solutions. We've talked about the problem, and there's natural sources, there's anthropogenic sources, and there is a threshold below which you are presumably reasonably safe. But sometimes matters do go out of hand, and we'll have to either at least first measure what we know, what's in the air, and second, try to see if we can mitigate the air or bring the air back under the threshold. Let's talk about your own research in sensors, understanding the air around us. Tell us a little bit about how do we sense the air around us to tell you your PM 2.5 is so many micrograms per meter cubed.
Yeah, so we're just talking about PM 2.5 or PM 10, particles. The simplest way to do it, and which is the most, I would say, federally recognized way to do it, is to collect particles on a filter that is well controlled beforehand. For you measure its weight, keep it under controlled conditions, and then you put it out there. You collect particles and you wait. That is a true measure of how many particles there are per meter cubed of air. You can get a true measure of concentration. But as you can imagine, that gives you maybe a 24-hour average. Not something that you can do daily. It can be pretty expensive if you're trying to do this in hundreds of sites. And then there's real-time measurements that you can make. And you're often not measuring the mass directly, but you use an equivalent measurement. That's just as a simple example. You might collect particles on a filter and send some radiation through it, beta radiation, which is just high energy electrons. And you see how many of these electrons reach the other side. As you fill up that filter with more and more and more particles, you'll get a little bit less of a radiation. You measure the change, and from both a little bit of theory and a little bit of empirical experimentation that, what does that change in radiation mean in terms of mass collected. And there are other metrics, like you've got a highly sensitive, a very highly sensitive vibrating reed, and as you start collecting particles on it, the vibration patterns change, and you can relate that back to mass. So these are standard techniques, and in the US and in India right now, some of these techniques are recognized as being the standard measurement technique. That if you make measurements with these techniques, you report it back to a general database, and they form the national database on air quality. So using the same kinds of equipment, well calibrated, and so on. These are the quote-unquote gold standard measurements.
We'll come to some of the work that you have done in your own lab to improve upon the gold standard, as you said. But let's switch gears and ask, what are some ways of controlling air quality? How do we keep the air quality below a threshold level? I'll presume there are only two ways. You fix the source or you fix afterwards.
Correct. So I think these measurements with these gold standard instruments, so to speak, right, give us the means to go and figure out what are the sources that are contributing to it. You look at those particles, dig into them. So the first step is to figure out what are the contributing sources. And they are different in different cities, possibly. And even within a city, it's possible that different sources are contributing differently. Identifying that is the first step. And you can only mitigate the problem if you know where the problem is emanating from. And so in this case, let us say you were in Bangalore or Bengaluru, you recognize that transportation is one of the main sources. Sure. So now you'd want to go after it. And transportation, to some extent, is an easy source to tackle because you can just require car manufacturers to comply with, let's say, BS4 regulations, right? So you really only are talking to 10 different companies to say it needs to be fixed. And so we've done a great job globally, I would say, in cutting back on tailpipe emissions. You may not think like that, but there's been tremendous change.
In fact, I remember there was a Volvo ad from the 80s in London that said the air going into the Volvo was dirtier than the air coming out of the tail.
Correct. I think Volkswagen or Volvo, one of those companies, said that the air coming out of your diesel car, that was a diesel car, because they were using what's called a diesel particulate filter that filters what's coming out of the tailpipe. And so what's coming out is cleaner than what's coming in. I don't know, there's been a controversy with diesel testing and Volkswagen, if you know.
Sure.
So you got to take some of that with a pinch of salt. But it is true that the emission standards are so tight right now that more and more the transportation emission sources are becoming maybe much less of a contributor to the total air quality here than they were even 10, 20 years back. But you must also remember that the number of vehicles on the road are going up exponentially. So the improved standards plus increased numbers still make transportation sector a big contributor of the air quality problem. And even within the transportation sector, it is these small, maybe 5% to 10% of vehicles that are the big polluters, the ones that may not have the right emission equipment, either it's malfunctioning or it's really old. That are the mega polluters, that probably account for, so maybe about, 10% of the vehicles might be accounting for 80% of the pollution. But again, a solvable problem there. But the other is the industries. The industries are usually the second largest contributor of air quality problems or the second largest sources of pollutants. And there are emission control technologies, whether it's for coal-fired power plants or for some of these industries, and there are regulations, so we have the tools in place, both policy and technology, and so there's the challenge of implementation and making sure that these are complied with.
This is one of those spaces where citizen science can presumably play a role. What are some citizen science efforts that you see as helping air quality globally, that have come to your know?
So, citizen science, for example, in the U.S. Runs the whole gamut here. The first is deployment of sensors is actually a big part of it. So we'll probably come back to sensors in a brief while. But how do we know where are the air quality problems? So if you take a city of like the city of Chennai, and I could be wrong in the exact number of monitors that exist, but the Tamil Nadu Pollution Control Board has a challenging problem here, right? I mean, it's a big city, pretty varied city. They can only put a finite number of these expensive, like I said, federally regulated methods, FRM, that are federal reference methods, FRM, that you can put, and maybe 6 or 10 stations, right?
We have one.
We have one right here in
IIT
IIT, as a matter of fact, right? And the question is, does it capture the entire diversity of air quality issues in a city like Chennai? And this is where citizens can play a role, right? If there are certain pockets where maybe there's a bigger problem, as an example, and I have no reason to make this example, I'm just going to throw this out. Maybe somebody's burning trash in a certain area, and that's affecting a small neighborhood, and then gets diluted downstream. So may not be registered by some of these monitors, but maybe affecting the health of that local community. So having just local monitors that citizens can access and buy and operate can help understand where these biggest problems are. And this is an approach China took at one time. They had thousands of monitors in the city of Beijing to identify these small sources that, when combined, was creating a major problem, but individually were difficult to track. So that's something that I think citizen science-driven identification of sources can be, one way to tackle one solution to this problem, and mitigation. To some extent, if you are the source of the problem, if you're burning trash, you might just being educated
Just
on the
knowing
implications of it.
that is a problem,
Correct,
is in itself half the victory.
exactly. Because I think a lot of times people just sometimes people are unaware, and sometimes, of course, there isn't an alternative, right? I mean, you don't know what else to do. But I think education could be one major part of what needs to be done. And we have one of these projects right now, an EPA project in the US right now. There are areas where environmental problems are bigger. So in addition to monitoring, what we try to do is have community outreach, where we go out there and explain these problems. And that helps both maybe mitigate these local sources that they're responsible for, and helps them, mitigate the health effects by either masking and so on.
I think we are probably in India on the cusp of a democratization of air quality data, air quality information, that I think will change our discourse, because you can see grassroots participation in not just the measurement, but also community solutions locally. I think that's a very nice takeaway. The problem in India is, of course, one, we are a growing economy. We have a demanding population, a growing up middle class, an aspirational young population. What are some challenges that are, in your opinion, somewhat unique to India that we should be aware of?
Yeah, no, I think India is in a bit of a development stage that is in some ways challenging, right? If you are relatively underdeveloped and poor, you have a you do have a problem with air quality, but not the magnitude that you might have what we have. If you are in the other end of the development scale where you are, relatively on the well developed, on the for, well, you might call it on the richer side of things, then the affordability of the mitigation technologies becomes a non-issue, right? Here we are where uh, it is critical to be continuing to develop and 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 also trying to avoid the pitfalls of past development pathways, which have always all of our known development pathways have been through fossil fuels, through pollution, and through subsequently cleaning it up. So India has to. The question is, can India do it differently? And I think it's not an easy answer, because the if you take any other approach, it's going to have other challenges with it. It could be, will it slow the path of development? So if you're going to try and go with only clean technologies, for example, or just for example, to take power. If you were to drop coal from the energy equation, there is no way you can power a country like India that's growing so fast. That just needs more and more and more power. There are clean technologies to minimize the emission coming out of the stacks of coal-fired power plants. They add a certain cost for to run these plants, which in turn will mean increasing the cost of electricity. The question is, will it then make it unaffordable? Will it then make your development? Will it then create a lag in the? Will it then affect the rate of development here? Right. So, I think the challenges are many. The difference, I would say, is that now we know we have the solutions. The question is, which of these solutions are we willing to consider? Because they've got pluses and negatives. There's both a positive element to it and negative element to it. One is, if you can employ these mitigation measures that are available now, technology-wise, you're going to have a cleaner environment, which in turn is going to help with a healthier population and possibly a more productive population. The negative is that somebody has to be bearing this burden of higher cost. And is it going to be uniformly spread? Is it going to be unfairly put on a certain subsection of the population? So these are challenging questions, where now that's why it's very, very critical to integrate the technology people with the policy people. And that's happening in India. There's a lot of fantastic work happening here through a lot of governmental organizations, but also non-governmental organizations. So I think it's obviously an interesting time, because India is becoming more and more aware. The one thing you will see is that compared to 10, 20 years back, the awareness about air quality has gone up a lot. And with awareness, only after awareness will people get to saying that I'm willing to bear this burden that comes with a cleaner environment, for example.
India's own national clean air program is very ambitious.
Yes.
It is purporting to reduce the PM10 by almost 40% in comparison to a baseline from some time ago. What have you seen as sort of the positive outcomes of that sort of an aspiration?
So I think so in India there have been a lot of policies, mostly driven by the central government, whether it's the Smart City program or the Swachh Bharat, and then Amrut scheme, and all of these have in turn. These are much broader than air quality, but air quality is a part of it. And they are now, firstly, that means policies are coming in support of this, of activities to reduce to reduce PM10 at least, but also PM 2.5 in the process. And, and so these have kicked into motion, and there have been, what is interesting is that not just are these policies proposed, but there's also parallelly studies by universities, by non-governmental organizations to look at the impact of these so that there could be science-driven policies made and science provide feedback on the effectiveness of the policies. So the question is, you decide that we want to cut pollution by 40%, let's say PM10 by 40%. You need to know which sources to tackle. And there's been a good amount of work in India done over the last 20 years to identify these sources. So we're going to be benefiting from all of that groundwork that's been laid and are benefiting. And that's sort of how some of the gains are being achieved. But now these continuing studies are able to provide a feedback on how effective are these policies that are trying to reduce PM10 emissions. As an example, not directly related to it, but as an example with the LPG work, there have been several large-scale studies where they've upgraded maybe an entire community, a large village or multiple sets of villages to LPG, and then looked at what the effective change in air quality has been. So this provides feedback on what the impact of policies are on the ground level air quality. And so I think this loop is important and is happening. Can the 40% be achieved is going to be a challenging thing, but at least the aim is in the right direction.
Wonderful. Let's talk about where can young men and women participate professionally? Where are opportunities for them to build a career? We've discussed about the problem, we've discussed about solutions. I'm a young person still in high school or in college. What are some established career paths for a young engineer in environmental engineering and in air quality management?
Yeah, no, that's again a good question here, because this is obviously an important topic that isn't going to go away in the immediate future. So there will be a need for people to participate at different levels. So we had talked about monitoring and measurements. So we would need people as the government is setting out more and more monitoring stations, as people are doing some of this own work, communities are doing their own work. There is a need for practitioners who can come out there and be part of these agency work. So these would be typically maybe undergraduate level engineers who can
or
go
even air quality technicians.
These could be technicians to maybe undergraduate level engineers. Technicians oftentimes, so that you can make sure that you're doing this monitoring work. Beyond this, there's two other elements. One is people who are actually building this equipment. So one, as we said, as we are putting out new and more stations, we need these equipment to be built, and a lot of these equipment right now is being built in India. Sometimes with licensing, but sometimes with innovation happening here. So that requires engineers who are now either undergraduate, bachelor's and master's level engineers who can participate in the development of these sensors, in the manufacturing and the fabrication of these. On the other side would be the data that's coming from these the air quality stations and the air monitoring network. That requires there's two kinds. One is you get all these. We talked about filters where you can collect particles and you want to know what's contributing to the local air quality. So you'll need to do chemical analysis. So there's a lot of analytical work that you need to do, whether it's mass spectrometers and so on. And that's a skill set that a lot of master's students in chemistry and biochemistry, environmental science bring in. And so there's a real need for people to be doing this sort of work. And these happen in a lot of environmental labs. And I would say the number of environmental labs that I have noticed in doing work with collaborators here over the last 15, 20 years is that they've gone up and up. And so the need for trained engineers or scientists has gone up. And so that's an avenue, especially at the master's level, I would say. But then and then we need to now understand as we make these policies, we need to understand what are the implications of these policies, what are the likely changes on the ground. That requires modeling. And there's a lot of modeling work right now being done in India, again, in government agencies, universities, and in non-governmental organizations like CSTEP in Bangalore. And so these jobs require folks at the students at the background in, again, maybe at a master's and PhD level with a background in environmental science, maybe air quality itself if the program offers. But in general, many of these engineers, whether you're a mechanical engineer, chemical engineer, civil engineers, they all could easily transition into one of these air quality modeling experts with just a little bit of self-learning afterwards, because you've got all the training, all of the background that you need. In addition to the modeling work, then you've got also now data that's coming in from sensors and so on. So I would say data analysts, data science majors, they could play a big role in the upcoming years.
So we talked of what I call AI, the real AI here, aerosol intelligence, being aware of what's in the air, being able to measure it, and then throw the artificial intelligence layer on top to really get something meaningful for policymakers and communities to find as solutions. Where is the role of entrepreneurship in this whole thing? If I'm a young person, I'm fascinated by this field, where are some opportunities from your vantage point?
Yeah, so, this is something that I've observed in the last 5-10 years in India. There is a tremendous amount of energy to come up with local solutions that are innovative, cost-effective, and very directed to the local problem. And I have seen companies, and I know that there are IATM startups that are looking at sensing technologies, because recognizing that the first step in solving a problem is in identifying it, in measuring it, in understanding where the problem is coming from. So that requires sensing technologies, and there's some very interesting new work happening here. And again, just for reference, right? The air quality problem here is unique in the sense that your WHO standard for PM2.5 is at 5 microgram per meter cube. So you've got to build instruments that can detect and tell you what's happening at below 1 microgram per meter cubed. So you need that sort of sensitivity and that sort of you need to have some high resolution to figure out, are you at 4.9 or 5. Our standards here are much lower, very different, right? Our standards here are very different. They could be at the PM2.5 standard is about 35 to 40 microgram per meter cubed. So our need for technology, the ideal devices that can work here could be very different than the ones you might want to put out in a place where they're trying to satisfy a standard at 5 microgram per meter cubed. And so there's a potential to create technologies that are relatively low cost, that could allow for ubiquitous sampling. And I think some of those solutions aren't going to be built outside, right? They're going to be built here. And in talking to some entrepreneurs here, I know that they're actually addressing that problem with local technologies. Additionally, so you're putting these sensors in, but additionally, I think there's potential for entrepreneurship on the data side of things, right? You get Now there's so much data coming out. How do you make sense of it? How do you map these? How do you go back and there's a variety of ways to monetize it, and the folks out there are going to be much smarter than I am. But as a simple case to observe is if you knew which were the dense spots, and if you could overlay it with people's affordability, you could find a way to connect the right products with the right people, with the right solution, so to speak, right? And so some of that really requires new thinking, new skills, and I think the entrepreneurs are probably the best place to address it. And I think in India, I wouldn't say that we have a tremendously established, or we don't have a well-established industry in the air quality side of things. Yeah. So, which is an opportunity for young entrepreneurs to come in and disrupt a market that's easy to disrupt, because a lot of the existing players are, maybe smaller subsidiaries of foreign manufacturers, or aren't that well established, that the barrier to entry is very high. So I think it's a good opportunity for entrepreneurs.
Anything we pay for, we know how to demand quality.
Correct.
With air quality, we pay for it with our health.
Correct.
Is there a tool out there that can inform people about, let's say, put some parameters in from the air around me and understand what the true cost that I am paying? So then I can sort of I can demand more of the air around me. Have you seen any ideas like this that you think can take role?
Yeah, so in the US, there are online tools that will get you to cost. What is the cost from a health perspective because of your local air quality, which in turn gets you to where do you want to address the challenges with some urgency. So this is part of what is referred to in the US as environmental justice, and because sometimes the worst air is also in the poorest neighborhoods. It's just in the way you lay out your air quality monitors and so on. There are just these pockets sometimes that are left where communities might be living near ports where a lot of big diesel trucks are coming in, and then you're exposed to all of the emissions, and you may or may not have a monitor in there, so it's not recognized as being an area that requires addressal. So by combining sensor data and these monitors that exist all over, and now also by looking at satellite data, you can now start mapping at pretty high resolution. And there's some really good satellite products right now that exist that give you a good first idea information about air quality in general. They're not great for pinpointing out exactly what's happening, let's say, in a 100-acre campus maybe, right? But you can figure out what are the bigger regional differences, and you can go down to urban quite well. And so combining these tools with other socioeconomic models out there are tools. I don't know personally of tools in India, but in the US they are available.
I think there is an opportunity again
Yes.
for somebody to contextualize
100%.
those kinds of tools for India.
Yes.
Let's come back to your own career. You started out as a student at IIT Madras, then a graduate student in Delaware, Minnesota, Caltech. You've been a faculty member at Clarkson University. You are now a chair professor there in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. But you're also an entrepreneur. You've practiced what you just preached. Tell us a little bit about your own startup and where you see that disrupting air quality.
Just so that the idea of the startup itself surprisingly came from a a sabbatical that I had in 2016 here. I had two sabbaticals in India. Spent both part of my time here in IIT Madras, and in 2009 when I came here, we made measurements in rural homes in the Tiruvallur district area, and we wanted to understand what are the air quality issues in these kitchens in some of these rural homes where women were spending about 2 hours a day cooking with solid fuels. And so we were taking these, $100,000 instruments that weighed 20 kilograms and occupying a big chunk of their kitchens, and they're very kind in allowing us to do that, right? I mean, there's an immense amount of kindness in rural India to allow us to get these sorts of data that at their cost of comfort and so on. And they may not even see the benefits of this for a while. But we benefited from the generosity. But we also realized at that point, that's when I realized that these tools that we have built and are available aren't appropriate for many of the problems that exist. So many of the problems exist in difficult to access regions, in poor communities, where spaces are tight, and in just areas where the air quality can be so high, so large that you may not need this sort of techniques there. So the idea was, can we build equipment that can address people's problems much more directly by giving them access to technologies to identify the air quality issues, identify mitigation measures that work. And so all of that requires sensors or instruments, or however you want to define it. These require sensors that are small, cheap, accessible, don't need a PhD to run the instrument. And so that was the initial sort of driver to look at alternative technologies that could get to air quality issues and help address them. The first step is to be able to detect it so we can then address it. And so we were developing these technologies in the university lab, and we tried to reach out to established air quality instrument manufacturers to see if they would be interested in commercializing it. But they did not feel like there was a market to do it. So while we recognized a market that they did not necessarily recognize, we didn't quite have the capacity to change their opinion at the time. So it was another of my
steps to put
myself in a difficult situation so I can go learn. So it was like getting back into a new PhD program for me, because I was now committing to a bit of a long-term effort to go learn something and hopefully come out at the other end with new knowledge. And the entrepreneurship there was, to some extent, I would say, something that came out because I had a vision of what I wanted to build for products and for what I wanted to build for. Let me take that back. So the entrepreneurship was a result of what I wanted to build as a solution to a problem that I saw, that I didn't see as being possible through existing companies or existing commercial entities that existed. And so that pathway started out around 2017 with federal funding through commercialization programs that have now gone on for the last 7 years or so, and have resulted in products that we are now deploying in places where we are now trying to address air quality, mostly indoors, but some of it also out.
That's the story of Telos Air.
Correct. That's the story of Telos Air, which is still, in my mind, a startup, even after 7 years. Because we are going after difficult problems. We're going after we are heavily technology oriented. and we are small, so it's still a small startup.
There's an IIT Madras startup that you may also be aware of called Carter, which
Yes,
Raghu runs, where he's trying to deploy the kinds of sensors you are developing on auto rickshaws
right,
and platforms that are mobile,
right.
so we can get GPS and pollution data simultaneously and get a richer view of the city
Right.
broadly. Wonderful. I think this is a space that is ripe for entrepreneurship. And help me make the case that there is also a good salary to earn for a young man or woman, young student to step into. That it is not that this goodness of doing something for society is not coming at any high personal cost.
Yeah, we're talking about a field that combines um, obviously a lot of physics, some chemistry. Not everybody's doing all of it, but this field combines physics, chemistry, engineering, math, data, math in the form of data analysis, computational techniques. So we're talking about a very technical field, and so you're talking about jobs that are going to be reasonably well paid, right? So that is, in my mind, a good bonus. You're going to be getting well paid because you're picking up these skills that are, or you're going to be bringing in skills that are unique. So these jobs require people tackling an interdisciplinary subject. And so these companies, if you're working for one of these companies, they're hiring you because you've got some in-depth knowledge, or as you work here, you're going to build some in-depth knowledge. And because your background, because you're going to be working with, and you're going to have your own background in engineering, you're going to be working with people who are engineers and scientists and technicians and modelers and policymakers. You're going to be in an environment that is rich for learning, and you're tackling a problem that's of importance to a lot of people. You can expect that this is a field that is going to have reasonably good remuneration, right? So, you know, I think that you're going to be. Let me take this back. So, while you're going to be excited by the fact that, while you should be excited by the fact that you are solving a problem of public importance, and you can, when you walk in on Monday morning, you're going to be excited with the fact that you are helping improve people's lives. The kind of companies that are working on these problems require experts, and you might come in as a raw engineer, but you are going to become an expert over time. And so that is going to ensure that your remuneration is going to be reasonable. Your tenure in these companies is going to be reasonable because you're going to become more and more important over time. And your knowledge is going to get broader with time because you're going to be learning new material. And all of these will combine to create what I might call a very satisfied career.
That's a good way to parse this. I think apart from,
Satisfying career.
I think while you build your own satisfying career, you can also gain in-depth knowledge, and that in-depth knowledge is rewarded over time. So there's a little bit of patience that is required versus some other disciplines where the reward is more here and now. In closing, this is clearly a very technologically sophisticated field. Uh, what is your advice to young men and women, young students who want to now take to this discipline? You've been in this space for 33 years. 1992 is when you probably first got introduced to the world of aerosols. Here we are in 2025. 33 years later, the problem hasn't gone away. 33 years from today, the problem will not go away. Help us, what's your advice to a young student wanting to get into this field? Particularly, if I may add, particularly if the student is interested in global opportunities. We're living increasingly in a world that's multinational and global?
No, I want to leave with a few maybe parting thoughts. One, starting with just the field, but then I want to go a little beyond that. Um, in 1960s, if you were to, you were out in Los Angeles and you were looking out, just north of Los Angeles are the San Gabriel Mountains, and 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 if you were looking out on a warm, sunny summer day, you would not see those mountains. Number one, there were days in 1950s and 60s you couldn't see down a block, just 100 meters you couldn't see during daytime, on a day. Now, most days you can see San Gabriel Mountains in the winter, the snow-capped peaks there, fantastic contrast to the warm, sunny weather in Los Angeles. And that's come about because of, dedicated air quality work by a number of engineers, scientists, technicians over 30, 40 years. And I think India is at the cusp of that, right? So during COVID, we got a bit of a glimpse of that. I remember people reading a news article about how people in northern Punjab were able to see Himalayas suddenly.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
They didn't realize that it's right there. So it is, I think, I think we are at the cusp of this problem where in the development cycle, we are getting on a per capita basis richer and there is a tipping point at which we begin to realize that the investment in these technologies to improve our health is the most important thing. And we are getting there. I don't know if we are there right away, but we are getting there. We're going to be there. And so this investment in air quality technologies, the investment in addressing air pollution problems, the investment in improving our health is all going to pick up. And the solutions will come predominantly from engineers, right? Engineers are trained to solve a problem. And so these solutions are going to come from engineers. Many of these are going to be maybe master's level engineers, or, having postgraduate degrees here. But it is an emerging field that is open to really engineers from all sorts of backgrounds, right? You could be a mechanical engineer, a chemical engineer, civil engineer, and you have your own perspective on this problem, and you're going to be part of the solution. And so this is a field that I think you want to keep an eye out for. The opportunities will exist, and when the opportunities come, recognize that you're getting into a field that is likely to grow over time. In terms of what young scientists or young folks who are going to be graduating and who are right now thinking about what course of study to take, I think I just probably want to lay out what I've gone through right here. I've started off as a naval architect, which means if I had stuck to that, I should be designing ships right now. I went on to do numerical work, which means I should be doing just some modeling work right now, or on to atmospheric work and so on, right? But right now I'm building sensors, which has required me to pick up some background in embedded systems, and we're looking at data is a big part of what we're trying to do with computer science related. So we're working on computer science related technologies that are all new to me. So so what I think is the take home message is that where you end up may not have any correlation to where you start, right? And engineering, the first 4 years of engineering is all about really building a strong foundation from which you can go in different directions. The stronger your foundations, you can really head in different directions much more confidently. So you may be a little bit unsure about whether you should be going into civil engineering or mechanical or aerospace. All I want to say is that if you, let's say, started off in civil engineering and your interest changed and you wanted to go into aerospace later, that pathway is possible, right? Because so much of the fundamentals are the same, and with the right effort spent, you can transform yourself along the way. Having said that, right, what I think is important is you spend time building depth in whatever you do before you start building breadth. You need both a little bit. There is a certain advantage to having breadth. The more topics theoretically you could be doing different things, but you need to put deep roots in a few fields at least. And I would argue that you might want to build enough breadth in everything you do, and you're going to be doing a lot of different things starting even in your 4 years of undergrad. If you can build depth, understand the deep, the fundamentals, the foundations, and so on, then getting into new topics and getting into breadth becomes easier. So let's say after your bachelor's, you get a job in a data science related company. Spending some time in understanding the fundamentals of data science, understanding a lot of the foundations related to that, allows you to now take your next step in maybe a different field. And so don't so I would say that you cannot underestimate the importance of building a depth in a field. And I don't know if that makes sense. I mean,
It sure does. I mean, you've spent 33 years in one field, and I don't know many people who can claim to have done something as deep as that. But at the same time, you are now dabbling in embedded systems and PCBs in the world of
Right.
Sensors. So there's clear evidence of breadth as well. I think breadth comes by just one's own curiosity as well as the need to learn, let's say, for the sake of solving the problem.
Exactly.
This has been a fascinating and wonderful conversation, Suresh. I think I learned a lot on why we do some of the things we do in this world of air quality, and more importantly, why should a common person out there become a citizen champion for a better city, a better air we breathe. Thank you so much for making the time to come join us on this conversation.
Thank you, Mahesh.
This is the Professor Mahesh Podcast, your resource to help you make informed career decisions. This podcast is brought to you by IITM Global, an initiative of the Office of Global Engagement at IIT Madras. Keep tuning in, listen to conversations such as this about various disciplines of science, technology, and engineering. We bring you Future Simplified. Thank you all. Be well, do good, and keep in touch.